Okay, now we're recording. Love that. Okay. So this is about kind of the competition theory and antitrust regulation. A lot of this, so the beginning part, we'll talk about just kind of some of the like theory and like what does it mean to have monopolistic competition and what some of these like words and phrases mean, such as weight loss, like what does that mean? What does that look like in the economy? And then talking about some of the, I guess we go to the objectives, and then talking about like fines and how antitrust is like regulated briefly, because that was a lot in the topic lecture. Understanding the different mergers and how some of this monopolistic competition takes hold, and then understanding the behaviors of monopolies and kind of how they act in the economy. And then probably most exciting part is some of the quirks of modern era of trust and monopolies, which is really when we'll put all of this together and really figure out why we have built a system that even without trust can still have monopolies. So why basically this modern era of like tech and venture capitalism means that in that system, there will always exist monopoly power, and basically how the only thing we can do about it is take down the system. So that's gonna be fun. But first, we have to understand what the system is, how everything works, and without doing that, we won't be able to kind of explain things. So it's really gonna be fun about this, as me as like more policy person, is that at the end there's going to be an activity about kind of explaining all of these theories and how that implicates especially big policy apps, especially on like the solvency level. So basically, if I'm thinking of someone who studied econ and was very much a very policy person, then I think that any judge is going to be open to some of these explanations. So it's going to be really practical, but got to shift to some theory to make that happen. So yeah, love that. So this is going to be starting with graphs in which I'm not just drawing. So this is the basic idea of surplus. So this is the basic supply and demand function. So we have the, I need a pointer. Mouse. Okay, I think you all can see my mouse now. So we have the supply function, right? That goes up. The more an item costs, the more willing someone is to make it. You have the demand function. Basically, the more something costs, the less you want it. Basic economics, where supply and demand meet as far as price. That is the quantity that will be produced. Where this is price and this is demand. So the difference between what a company is willing to make an item for versus what it's charging, which is what this is. So the difference between here, where they're willing to make it, and what they're charging is the producer surplus. So it's the extra kind of the extra happiness, if you will, extra money that the producer gets. And similar for the consumer. So if you get something for less money than you're willing to pay for it, then that is a good deal. Then you get that surplus, you get kind of that happiness, if you will. Producer surplus doesn't, or consumer surplus doesn't mean like profit, doesn't mean money in your pocket necessarily. It's rather the difference between what you pay and how much you are willing to pay. So that's what these surpluses mean. In the economy, surplus is good. You want that. You want consumers to feel like they're getting a good deal and producers to feel like they're getting a good deal, because that will makes just a better functioning economy. Efficiency is measured in surplus. The goal of efficiency is to have the most surplus, to have everyone as happy as possible. Does that kind of make sense as the basics of surplus? I think most of you don't have cameras on, so I'm just going to keep going until someone stops me with a question. So now I'm going to get something more interesting. Now we're going to start drawing. Oh, I can actually draw on here. I guess I don't need to draw up all the graphs. Unless I want to. You know what? I'm going to. Make this a little bit so that you're all just not staring at PowerPoint slides all of the time forever, because that has to be boring.
Do you think you can like label what this like? Because I'm like, I get that like consumer surplus is like CS, and I think producer surplus is like PS, but like there's like I expect there's gonna be a lot of symbols on these graphs, and it might help to like have them.
Yes,
Fine.
perfect. That's why we're going to the whiteboard now. Can everyone see my whiteboard?
Yes.
Okay, love that. Perfect. So yeah, we're going to now go to perfect competition and do a lot more of that. Oh, I don't like that color. When I practiced it, it wasn't this color. Let me try again. Okay, perfect. These aren't going to be perfect, but these are going to be more interesting than looking at pre-made pictures all the time. So we're gonna have our main. This is demand. I will write that in a sec. Okay, now text. That is a good point. So this is MC, so marginal cost. This is the demand curve, as we saw. So the supply is actually the marginal cost, which, because the more you produce, as the change in the marginal cost starts changing. So that's why this is like a curves line as opposed to the direct supply. It has to do with like the derivative because it's marginal on the margins. That really doesn't matter as long as you kind of know the basic look of it. This is going to be marginal revenue. Okay. It doesn't let me shift. So what happens here? So the profit maximizing point is when MR equals MC. The reason has to do with like the derivative of profit, because that's, you know, revenue minus cost. You want to maximize that. When you take the derivative of both, you get marginal cost equals marginal revenue. That doesn't really matter as much as this is the basic like formula. It doesn't matter if you know the calculus and how that works. Doesn't matter. But all you need to know is wherever the additional amount that it costs you to make something and the additional amount that you get in that thing equal each other is where you're going to produce, because that is where you make the most profit, right? You want to go up to that point, and then when you do that, you really maxed out the profit, because if you made one more item, it's then going to cost you more to make that one more item than you are going to get for making that one more item, which is the kind of basics there. So in perfect competition, it is where the marginal cost equals, draw formats, is going to be this point here, is perfect competition. So that's going to be, not where we're getting monopolies, but in a perfect market, this is exactly where we get. This is the, because this is the quantity, this is the price, right? Price up here. Oh, it's already getting a lot happening on this graph. Okay, so this is what's going to happen, right? This orange star here. But what happens in a monopoly is they are trying to maximize profit. So what happens is they produce where MR equals MC, which is here, But because they're a monopoly, they don't have to charge here. Instead, they get to charge along the demand curve, which means they get to charge right here. Right, all of this is going to make sense. Monopoly charges here. Okay. Everything's going to be slightly right to wherever I draw, is because this is how this text is working. So now the actual interesting part here. So what happens in this difference here, that used to be surplus, because I'm just going to point for right now. Is that this used to be, use orange, the point of consumer surplus versus producer surplus. These whole boxes here. So this I can erase. Used to be the consumer surplus, and this down here was our producer surplus and the perfect competition. But it's not anymore. Instead, we're looking at the difference, back to blue, of the consumer surplus, which is, oops, sorry about that. I was still on eraser, it turns out. The difference between what is charged versus what consumers are willing to pay is now here, which is, I know, I said I'd use less symbols, but here we are, consumer surplus. So that's not quite the important part yet. Versus the producer surplus is now all of, let me pick another color, this whole box here. Okay, we're almost done with this, don't worry. And so this is producer. And so now what's the two parts of here, doesn't matter if you followed up to this point. The only two parts you need to know is that what was surplus is now not surplus, which is what we call dead weight loss. So this is red. I'm going to call it red because it's bad. Dead weight loss is this whole chunk here. This is now dead weight loss. That's a little hard to see. And the other important thing here is this part used to be consumer surplus and is now producer surplus. This is what the monopoly steals from the people. It's called the monopolistic transfer. I just want to call this oof, that is not a good color. Transfer. Okay, I know there's a lot going on in this graph here, but all you really need to know as we walk through that, hopefully the walkthrough helps somewhat as opposed to just looking at pictures. I don't know, maybe not. So we only wasted like 6 minutes, it's okay. Is that we have both dead weight loss, which is surplus efficiency that went to no one, and a real chunk of that happiness or that willingness to pay moved from the consumer to the producer because of monopoly. So it not only created inefficiencies in the market, it also transferred happiness, willingness to pay from the consumer to the producer. Right. Those are really the only two things that were important to know there. Okay. I'll stop sharing that. I'm going to review the graphs because I know there was a lot there. Any questions on that? Does that kind of, those two concepts of less efficiency and producers steal from consumers?
Could you put the graph up for a second? I want to take like a screenshot for my notes.
I don't know how I get my whiteboard back. Yes, here we go. Okay. Also in the PowerPoint slides, I have like actual other graphs versus my scribbles, but I thought the process of actually kind of walking through how things function is helpful, hopefully. Okay, are we good? Okay, perfect.
Yep.
Now back to the actual presentation. You find the presentation. Okay, now Victoria is done with her weird graphs. So now back to more debatey things. Okay, so this is what we were looking at. Perfect competition versus what was consumer is now producer. Mouse here. This is the chunk, this is the transfer, and this is the dead weight loss. Okay, Good. So all we know really is that there's a chunk that the monopoly took from the consumer, and there are inefficiencies in the economy. Right? I just feel like graphs are the way to learn that. Okay, now the one type of monopoly that economists think are okay / are generally government-ran entities. This is important because a lot of literature will refer to natural monopolies, and it's important to know that natural monopolies are not necessarily bad. They're different from any other type of monopolies. So natural monopolies are monopolies, if you will, where the startup cost is so massive, but the independent cost of each additional item is not that much. So natural monopolies are things such as electrical companies. Doing the power lines, doing all of that is really, really expensive. But the individual supply of electricity is so much less. So that a lot of these are owned by co-ops or they're owned by the government. The United States Postal Service is another great example of natural monopolies. Setting that system up is really, really expensive. But once the system is set up, it's not that expensive to send each additional letter, right? But if you wanted to create a whole new postal service, that would be enormously expensive. Other examples like broadband, utilities are generally natural monopolies. Natural monopolies are not really bad. They're often owned by the government. Just know that those are a type of monopoly that might be referred to, right? Now we're done with pure econ. So if you tuned out and you were like, dear Lord, there's a lot of graphs, I don't know what's happening. All right, we're done with that. Now moving on to some more debate. We're getting towards the debate applications. Don't worry, we're getting there. So fines. I know Caitlin probably talked a lot about some of the fines, and we know like what the Sherman Antitrust Act is. One thing that's really important to note here is that under Sherman that there have really only been 157 fines and penalties, at least over $10 million. When you think about the amounts that companies such as Amazon, Microsoft, etc. make, it is so much more than $10 million. So the important part of knowing these fines is that they are significantly less than an optimal fine. So what is an optimal fine? So the economics defines it as the deadweight loss plus the monopoly transfer, the monopoly like externality, if you will, times the probability that it is detected. So you want the fine to equal the inefficiency in the market plus what the producers steal from the consumers, and then times probability, as things always are. So if you think you're 50%, able to be detected for this, then half it, etc. So that's what the optimal fine is. Now the thing is that optimal fine is certainly over $10 million in more than 157 cases. So the important part of understanding how antitrust law works now is it's based on, like, this is what they're trying to do, but this is not what they do, is that it's not enough. So the fines alone are definitely not enough. The only situations other than fines, which happens way less now, is breaking up big companies. But in a moment, we'll talk about why that's not really enough to break up big companies. Okay, now into the mergers and consolidations. So there are two types of mergers. So there are horizontal mergers and vertical mergers. And there's also, let's talk about the network effect after that. So horizontal mergers are where you buy out everyone in your competition, right? So think of, is it T-Mobile and someone else? I had this and I forgot. I should have written down in my notes that like merged into a single like cell carrier. That is a horizontal merger. You start buying out your competition. Disney buying 21st Century Fox. That is a horizontal merger. You are merging across the board, just like horizontal lines being across. That is what a horizontal merger is. This is something that the antitrust regulations as of now are trying to break down, right? So they stop acquisitions or mergers or consolidations of companies based on horizontal mergers pretty often. Now, the next type of merger is a vertical merger. Sounds exactly what it is, which is down the supply chain. right, is what a vertical merger is. A very good example of this is a lot of the Monsanto stuff in big ag. So Monsanto creates the technology for these genetically modified organisms, specifically in the corn market, for example. They then create the seeds. So they have the laboratories that not only do the technology, they create the seeds, create the physical product. From the physical product, they then sell it as a distributor to the farmers. And then sometimes Monsanto also owns the farms, right? And so this is a great example, or terrible if you're a citizen in the world, terrible example of the idea of vertical merger, right? Is where you start buying up everyone underneath you. You start being every single level of production. Another example of this that is happening is, I have feelings about Disney, is Disney. So they have, as we've seen with a lot of their film releases, is that they are not only doing horizontal mergers by doing things like buying out Marvel, they are also doing a vertical merger where they are the tech, or where they are the like tech and like production company, where they are making the films, they're distributing the films, and then they're putting it on Disney Plus. So they are like the full to consumer distribution of the films and taking out everyone underneath them. Right? So this is a perfect example of a vertical merger, a vertical consolidation, right? Is Disney. Also, Disney's doing horizontal. Also buying a 21st Century Fox. Disney is just a grid of terrible monopolistic behavior. And then there's copyright laws, which I'm not going to get into, but I have feelings about Disney. But those are some examples of what a horizontal merger and a vertical merger is going to look like. Right? So another type of, not merger, but thing related to monopolies that starts happening is this idea of network externalities. So the greatest example of a network externality, not the context of monopolies, but the best example is Facebook. Facebook is only useful if all of your friends and people you know have Facebook accounts. It is not useful to have a Facebook if no one you know and no one in your circle, no one in your network has a Facebook. But if everyone in your network and everyone in your general vicinity has a Facebook account, Facebook becomes significantly more useful. This is a perfect example of something being more effective because of its network. One thing we see with the network externality, think of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is really a great beneficiary of the conglomeration effect, which is not a well-named academic term. It literally just means to conglomerate, put all together. This is exactly what it sounds like. So Silicon Valley and having access to like super high-speed broadband, having a lot of like satellite technology, having a lot of really good engineers and computer scientists all in that region close to Stanford and Berkeley. All of that is a conglomeration impact, right? It's not a wonder that all of these big tech companies started popping up together, right? It's not a big wonder that places like IBM existed, you know, in Texas around like UT and near Texas Instrument, like in the 60s and 70s, right? Like that wasn't an accident. This is a conglomeration impact. This is a network effect. So what happens is those big companies, whether it's, you know, in Austin, Texas or in Silicon Valley, they get together and then everyone else outside that doesn't get those externalities. They don't get that effect. And then they kind of die off. So it's kind of, it is a part of like an oligopoly or a monopoly led by many to have these sort of network effects. And then something else that ends up happening when you do these big mergers, is specifically a reason to do a horizontal merger, is economies of scale. There's a reason that Walmart is able to sell things cheaper, or Amazon is able to sell things cheaper than mom and pop stores. When you have a big economy of scale, you're able to do things very efficiently, then you're able to make more money. Everything becomes cheaper because you're able to do it so many more of them across the board. And so that's the big reason that companies want to do these like big growth and these acquisitions, is because of these economies of scale. Things get cheaper when you can do it all in a bunch of steps, right? Because it's the whole like, you know, have taken economics courses, most of you. So like the whole like, why doesn't a chicken sandwich cost $2,000? The answer is because you're able to specialize and do things all at once. Think of like the Model T, all of these things, right? On to mergers. Okay. Now we can go to some monopolistic behaviors. Do I still have everyone? Is everyone still, because that makes sense kind of so far. We're going to start getting to more like application-y parts of it. Thank God. Okay. I know you all are like, oh my gosh, Victoria, this has been a lot. I thought this was just going to be about the CAPK. It almost is. So now the behaviors of a monopoly. So we have the market allocation, which is when monopolies kind of get together and they start deciding who gets what part. So one area this happens is electricity, right? So why is it that, you know, ComEd controls most of Illinois? Georgia Power is, of course, Georgia. You know, there's like little co-ops. Like I know I paid to the LA Department of Water and Power when I lived in LA. Like that's a market allocation. Another good example of this, which now I don't think a lot of you all are watching college football, but if you are, the ESPN's like SEC network, Pac-12 network, Big Ten network, Big 12 network, all the major conferences have it, which is another market allocation, right? You can only get those special channels in those markets. And that way they can show just SEC football, and people who went to an SEC school are big fans of college football in the South will pay a lot of money for that. But someone who lives in Oregon is probably not going to pay a lot of money for that, but they will pay a lot of money for Pac-12. And so this is a way of getting those market, the like market capitalization in a regional aspect, right? And then I'm getting into some of the bad. Market allocation is probably okay, but we get some of the bad stuff now, is the bid rigging, which if you think of one of the best examples of kind of a cartel monopoly, of course, is OPEC that starts, you know, kind of becoming a cartel and fixing how much you bid for things. Not that OPEC is bidding for things, but think of like construction companies and even production companies for things like movies, all working together to kind of price fix the bidding. So price fixing the supply side is what bid rigging is. And now we have price fixing, which is where everyone kind of agrees on a certain price, and that is what everyone is charging. And if no one undercuts the market, then everyone gets to charge more money and make more money, right? So this is something that you see some with like even like gas stations, everyone just kind of charges the same amount, so you can't really go anywhere else. Even like high-tech computers, like I know that like Apple and producers of like gaming PCs could probably charge a whole lot less, but if they all agree to not charge less, then everyone is fine. And then we have predatory pricing. Now we get into the real fun stuff, which is predatory pricing and growth. Here is where we get to the modern monopolies. So the idea of predatory pricing, I'm going to use Amazon as the example for everything because they really do this aggressively, which is the idea, which is according to think Oxford language. So I got this definition: the pricing of goods or services at such a low level that other suppliers cannot compete and are forced to leave the market. Now, the greatest example of this in the modern times is absolutely the Amazon basics, right? We've maybe all, I assume we're all on woke YouTube, moderately woke, low level woke, YouTube, in which we've heard about even small Amazon sellers. So one thing that Amazon does is, of course, able to track everything that happens on Amazon. So third-party sellers will start selling something. It's great. They start making some money. It's great for them. Everyone's doing well. You know, small businesses, we love them, said Amazon. We give them a platform, said Amazon. And so then what happens is through their analytics, through the data, they're able to find what it's selling. So maybe it's phone cords, something as simple as that. Amazon basic phone cords. We've all bought them. No, let's not lie. To charge our iPhones because we are terrible anti-capitalist. And so then what happens is because Amazon is so big and has exclusive deals with producers and can be like, hey, we're more stable than this mom and pop company who's making chargers, just start producing just for us at a lower price, but we'll buy 10,000 of them as opposed to the 200 that this other small shop is buying. then they're able to put those on Amazon Basics. I know we've all been looking for something that seems pretty, well, basic. And we are on Amazon, and we then decide to buy the Amazon Basic because it is rather cheaper than any of our other options. Maybe it's t-shirts, basic t-shirts. Amazon was like, hey, I bet I could undercut all of the competition. And they do. That is the strategy of Amazon, is they don't need to turn a profit on that because they have profit from other things, whether that is your data, we'll get to in a moment, or like your Amazon Prime membership. They don't need to turn a profit. So they can undercut anyone in the market and force them out of the market. And then once the competitors are forced out of the market, because competitors do need to turn a profit on their things, then they start raising the price, which is the reason that it's called predatory pricing, is because you prey on the smaller companies until they leave the market, or like if you're an animal, you eat them. And then once that happens, you're able to hike up the prices. This is what Amazon does all of the time. And when you have monopolistic buying power and economies of scale, you can do this pretty easily, which is literally the entire thing on Amazon Basics. That's why I don't have an Amazon account. I have account. That's why I don't have Amazon Prime anymore, because this is absolutely like a terrible practice, but they can do it. So let's talk about why they can do it. Why does Amazon, Uber, Lyft, why can they go so long without making profit? A lot of this has to do with the modern capitalist system. So the rise of venture capitalists and the Silicon Valley tech, right? What's happened is you don't need to turn a profit for many years, maybe even ever, because you will still get a lot of capital. So instead of you investing in R&D based on your own profits, the money that you make, you are instead able to get venture capitalists, sell your IPOs without ever turning a profit, or even proving profitability, go on venture capital markets, get seed funding. So what these venture capitalists get, what seed funders get, is stake in the company. So they care about, now because of modern wealth inequality, they care more about getting more wealth than they do income, which means you can invest more than your profits. Used to only be able to invest in profits in R&D, but now companies such as Uber and Lyft are able to invest only like just a massive quantity, more than they should be able to, in things such as tech, research, and marketing. It's why we see so many Uber commercials, but they also, I think now recently they might be turning a profit, but like hadn't turned a profit in years. And the reason is because of this idea of growth versus profitability. Now companies, for their stock prices to continue to go up and up and up, as we've seen with companies such as Tesla, as we've seen such as Uber and Amazon, is you don't need to turn a profit to be able to grow. What venture capitalists in the age of technology, which is where we are, care more about is just growth, the idea of potential, getting that market share, right? It's the reason that Tesla entered into the S&P 500 without really being a profitable company, because all of that money that Tesla is making is going back into marketing, it's going back into research and development, building better batteries, building better EV technology, building the charging stations, because eventually in 20 or 30 years, they're going to be massively profitable when they turn that marketing and research money into profit for shareholders. People are now playing the long game. Part of the reason that you're able to do that is because people now care more about wealth than income, right? We're seeing this wealth, this big wealth divide. And what it means is people who are enormously wealthy are able to take out like loans that they don't have to pay taxes on, to then fund their lifestyle and to fund their life and never actually need to make an income. They're able to just transfer their wealth into like money they can live on and pass that on through generations. So they would rather accumulate wealth because it means they can have access to income without having direct income, which just means they pay less in taxes, and they're able to build up this wealth, which means these companies aren't actually unprofitable. Rather, they choose to put their money that would be in profits, would be to shareholders, instead in building up the company and investing back into the company as opposed to turning a profit. So they would rather operate at a loss and use all of that money into building up the company and building up this massive like conglomerate and just taking down other companies, even if it means operating at a loss and using this monopoly power, because it means in the long run, their seed funders, their venture capitalists, even now their stockholders are better off as they see in the modern economic system. What this also means is that simply splitting up Amazon isn't going to solve this behavior, because it's based on the difference of what a company is making versus what they're investing back into themselves, and the difference between growth and profitability. So not only is there this profit driver, of course, to make more money, but now it's not even the profitability that's concerned as much as it is your ability to invest back into yourself to have massive on-paper growth, because that's how these venture capitalists are actually able to fund more projects. Which is a fun quirk of the modern economic system, which we love. The last time that we saw a lot of this growth versus profitability and a lot of IPOs being this unprofitable as I enter into the IPO or into individual like stock offerings, was the dot-com bubble. So that is a fun fact. I don't know where that's going to lead as far as the economy and any potential collapse of stocks, but that is some fun fact for you. Is the last time we saw a lot of these markets play was the dot-com bubble. So, yeah, do with that info as you will. So now the quirks of some more quirks of the modern economic machine is the big tech agreement. So a lot of this kind of, as we talked about, the like conglomeration effect is a lot of this like big tech agreement, whether it is a lot of these PCs, Android products, needing like Microsoft Office and running on those products, and the collaboration with Microsoft, even the ability of, so like Facebook and Google Ads, another great example of this, Facebook and Apple and Google with like Google Chrome on Macs, things like that. All of these are big tech agreements. Otherwise, if these agreements didn't exist, then you wouldn't be able to run things such as Microsoft Office for Mac, or even Google Chrome for Mac, but obviously all that exists. One thing that happens with the, I think Caitlin talked about some, was the antitrust laws are written about consumer welfare tests. So basically, are the consumers benefiting from this? They have to be hurt, and the consumers have to actually be hurt, the public, in order for anything to basically be done about these trusts. So the part of the reason Amazon hasn't been broken up is the consumers are fine. They're doing great because prices are cheap. But obviously that doesn't take effects like all the producers that go into this. And then the third thing is labor practices. So one of the things that happens with the monopolistic power is also the other way. So monopolies are also, so like Amazon also has a monopoly over like as the producer. So that means that all labor must buy from them, if you will. So as one of the only often employers, big employers of an area, they're able to use that monopolistic competition from this like demand side and use them, just have terrible labor practices, which is something that happens whenever the producer has more control than the labor market. So that is another like kind of quirk that we're seeing that existed when there were big monopolies as well. Like Standard Oil also had a lot of these problems with like labor practices. That's why we saw the rise of unions, and all of that was because when one producer just has so much power, we start seeing a lot of these like harms. Another quirk, of course, is the growth over profitability. We've talked a lot about in the like price fixing. Thought it just made more sense to, not price fixing, predatory pricing. It made more sense to do it there. And then data. So data is a really interesting, concerning part of the modern monopoly. So the last thing is going to talk about data. So one kind of concept that has started coming up in modern like theories, especially big tech, is there's a Netflix documentary on this too, which is that the product is not now necessarily just you buying things on Amazon, but you and your data as the product. So some of the reasons behind that is so the power of connected data, and the reason that it matters that these companies are so big, and something that honestly, like maybe an antitrust staff could help with, is kind of breaking up this data. So whenever you're able to have connected data to a singular person, it doesn't have to be, it's not like necessarily connected to your name, but connected to like your IP address, you as a human, you're basically just numbers out there that Google has connected your profile, and they've connected your profile with, data sharing agreements with Apple, with, Google and Facebook. Everyone is all working together to combine you into a single user. So what happens whenever they have combined you into a single user, they not just get a bunch of data of you, they also get what we call longitudinal data, which is the kind of cross-sectional, a bunch of data on you, but a bunch of data on you across time. And what happens when you have the same person connected, all of their data, massive quantity of data, whether that is keywords, searches, how often you're texting, the tech you use, what sort of connected devices you use to your location. They obviously know your schooling level based on things such as your network on places like Facebook. They're often able to figure out your race, your ethnicity, your income bracket. Or if they're not, you're logging into your bank account using Google Chrome on your MacBook. So they're able to read all of that because all of the data is pretty easily scraped. And when you download browsers on your computer, and when you buy a computer, you have signed your life away in data. So they're able to connect all of that. And what's even more important is not only they're able to connect you as a person, they're able to do that over time. They're able to see changes in your activity and predict what you're going to do next. Now, it's really this fun, terrible, whatever word you want to use here, interesting about these predictions is because when they get, a cross-sectional of you now, they're able to figure out what you're going to do next. And because everything is longitudinally connected, they're able to tell whether or not they're right. It's the reason that the CAPTCHAs or the like, are you a robot? Click, the little find the taxi, find the sidewalk. It's the reason that those have gotten more complicated is because we've taught AI how to think like a human in those CAPTCHAs, which is the reason it used to be, can you read these like scribbly letters? But then we taught computers how to do that. And so now it has to get more and more complicated. So what we've done with our data, specifically the longitudinal data, is that we have taught it whether or not it was right about our predictions. So now it's able to make even better predictions on our data. It means that specifically, like with artificial intelligence, it's able to run you in your data millions of times, figure out which is correct based on your actions. And then based on that, it's able to figure out what you're actually going to do next, which means not only what are you willing to buy, not only the ads, but also predicting you as a human. And this predictive technology is one of the most powerful parts of data and technology. It's also like what economics are hoping to do, but hopefully not this dark and dystopian. I mean, economists are this dark and dystopian. I definitely worked on a project in which we were like linking DNA with cognitive ability, dementia, and your income after retirement. It's a whole thing, NIH funds these things. So imagine also what the government is doing, not the point. And so then one of the interesting parts of this big tech is that big tech not only owns and creates the data, is able to gather the data however they see fit. They also own the technology, and especially in the instance of Amazon and Google, also own the computing power and the AI behind it, which has implications including marketing, but also implications well beyond marketing. So part of what this means in the context of antitrust is a lot of these kind of big tech impacts that we're going to see in this AI and such, because of these data sharing agreements and because of this connectivity, as long as data is the project, as is the product, it may or may not impact the number of companies who own it, because they're all tracing you. It might impact, right? If Google doesn't control Google Chrome and Maps, doesn't know your location and your search history and every single website you go to, and is able to scrape your data from your emails and able to scrape your like all of your like like web pages and your bank info. And they're also not having data sharing agreements, you know, with Apple who's reading your text or whatever. Like maybe that will help, right? Maybe that does something. But in the world of all these data sharing agreements, there's also the world in which there's literally nothing to solve any of this, and there is no way of solving it. Yeah, this probably goes beyond marketing. Which brings us to the activity. What do you want to get out of all of this? Victoria's rants about how our data is all being taken, and sometimes with our DNA data. I don't know if people should do a 23andMe, but that's a separate way. So where does all of this lead in the context of this topic? So this is thinking about the cap K, whatever form of cap K, whether that's semio cap, racial cap, traditional cap, white Marxist, whatever. Versus like a policy activity and also thought experiment, which is so utilizing the policy app in the packet or any other policy app doesn't particularly matter in this instance versus whatever form of cap. So thinking about specifically the econ page of the policy app and explaining why the app can't solve the underlying problems, I have 5 reasons here. So using the theory. So the first is the profit motives and the monopolistic competition, which you saw the graphs and how the difference between what you charge versus what you're able to create a product for. If the app can't solve for that, then how can they solve for the kind of stealing of consumer surplus and creating the dead weight loss? And so that's the second is the ideas of stealing surplus, why companies want to do that and why that's the ultimate goal. The answer is to create profit. So those go together. Third is the growth goal of companies and the modern like system of these venture capitalists and this idea of profitability versus growth. If the app can't actually solve for that, then what does that mean for the actual stability of the economy? As they explained, like if you can't break up the behaviors that caused Amazon, then what good is breaking up Amazon? Fourth is a lot of these behaviors of monopolies, such as like predatory pricing and market allocation and price fixing. And then fifth, which is especially for like more high theory, I think is particularly fun, which is the data as a product. If it's no longer what monopolies can sell to us in our market, but also us as the product and our linked data as the product, then why does that mean that the app can't actually solve for anything? If it doesn't solve for that, which it can't. Breaking up monopolies cannot solve for this data as the product. And then giving, however long, I think 1.5 minutes is definitely by far a lot on this would be like part of a block on like an econ flow on why they can't solve, but doesn't have to be a full 1.5 minutes. But yeah, explaining kind of how that functions and what that means. Yeah. Any questions? That's been a lot of rants about things. I can pull back the activity up in a sec, but okay. But yeah, I can also screenshot that and send that out or whatever. But yeah, any sort of questions, thoughts, kind of understand what was happening? Is that helpful? Any questions about like the utilization part? Good. Okay, anyone else feel like we're living in a dystopia now after discussions of our data and how all of that functions? The more you study data and the more you work in it, the more terrified you are. Literally working on a project that linked up people's DNA and brain scans with dementia and the cognitive function and economic indicators was wild. And I think at the time didn't realize just how dystopian it is. But yeah, that's a thing that's happening. Yeah, I'm never taking a 23andMe test. But yeah. Don't take 23andMe test. But yeah, any question? Anyone else is kind of terrified of big tech now? Anyone excited to think about the CAPK and whatever form of anti-capitalist revolution against like policy Fs, and they literally can't solve for anything and can do literally nothing. Right. I think that's all I have. This is about an hour. If we don't have questions, I can put, I might just pop a screenshot of activity slide if anyone's interested. At the very least, it gives you an outline of reasons why AF can't solve on like the CAPK. So it gives you some like, you know, solvency takeouts. So that's useful at least against any sort of policy F. Hope you all heard that screenshot. Love that for me. Yeah, love that. And now if you all take econ in college, you've at least heard some of the phrases. You'd be like, ah, producer surplus, I've heard about that. And so, yes, you all do have debates happening. So, yes. All right, well, that's all. I'm going to end this. Thank you all so much for joining me as I ranted about economics and big tech. So, let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you for the lecture.
Yes, thank you all.